The time has come to deal with the shutter and lens assembly. I have most of the components cleaned for the body. I've just got the shutter and the rangefinder assembly to deal with, and the top cover probably needs to be cleaned too. So we'll have a look and see what the state of these is. The lens looks good. I think that should be fine. Just we cover these shims. We've got a selection here. Got a metal shim and at least 3 paper shims. Of course, these are all soaked in oil, which glues them in position. Probably doesn't do a hell of a lot for their integrity. Gotta be careful getting these off. See if I can get it off in one piece. Yeah, that looks fine. They will have to be cleaned with solvent. Yeah, it looks like 3 paper shims and 1 metal shim. Okay, the shutter itself. Someone's been in here before. There's a variety of scratches here, which tells me that somebody was unscrewing the retaining ring using the tip of a screwdriver, and they slipped on repeated occasions. They've made a bit of a mess. So I will want a toothpick to do the job properly. Of course, there was one sitting here all along. Well, the retaining ring is certainly not over tight, probably not tight enough, I would have thought. We'll take the retaining ring off, put its screw carefully to one side. Lift off here, we've got a variety of pieces, of course. This is the lens mount piece. It's got the detents here for our shutter speed clicks. Here's the piece with our aperture numbers on, and basically this telegraphs the numbers from the ring in here, couples to this ring, and this ring, which I can see is bent out of shape, couples with a fork here on the aperture lever. And this is our shutter speed setting dial. This is the cam plate for the shutter speeds. This is the piece that actually, as you rotate it, it sets the detents for the shutter speeds. This little lever is the piece that blocks the shutter release from being depressed if the shutter's not actually cocked. Take out that little pinion, remove the internal cocking ring. I can remove the shutter release lever. I'll remove the main spring from the shutter. And have a look at that. These springs are very often tired. They've taken a set. That one's in quite good order. It appears to me that may have been tightened up by someone, I'm not sure. That's in quite good order. It's common. There's the main drive cam. And into the shutter mechanism itself, well, I'll remove the speed trains. First I'll remove the gear trains. I'll remove this as the self timer, or the delay action. It would help if I was using the right screwdriver. Two screws hold that one's loose. 2 screws here hold the retard gear train in place. that loose one at this end, that forms the pivot, because you can adjust the position of the retard gear train inwards or outwards for greater or lesser engagement with the main drive cam in order to adjust the shutter speeds. Let's disassemble this piece. There's multiple things going on here. This is the latch that holds the main drive cam in the cocked position, and its return spring that's activated by the shutter release and turn. Here's our flash contact. Unhook that component. I'll just release that catch. I've got to unhook this spring next, and it would help if I had the right pliers for that. I'll find them in a second. Round here, this is our B lever. That's held in position with a screw here. That screw also holds the return spring for our MXV setting lever there. There's the return spring. There's the B lever. And the B lever's return spring is this little one here, which I'll just unhook. And now I need to get those pliers. So I've got to unhook this spring from that arm there. Of course, when I start pulling on the spring, the arm will start moving too, so it's a game of chase. So what I'm going to do is I'll put a screwdriver in here to block the rotation of the arm. Then I'll push this spring away from me here so I can unhook it. And I don't have to unduly stress this spring or stretch it out any further than I need to. This little pallet wheel can come off. The pallets here are fixed to the plate, they stay in place. There's one more fine spring has to come off here. It's on this little latch lever here. I'll unhook that. I put a toothpick over the centre of it so it couldn't get away while I was unhooking it, because otherwise it's in the habit of pinging off into the distance. That spring looks unusually tight. There's more tension than I'm used to seeing on that component. That may mean that someone's improved it. You got to watch out for people's improvements. So 3 screws on the back of the case hold the outer case to the inner case. These screws are a little bit damaged looking. No special reason for that, unless the person doing the job had a crappy set of screwdrivers. At the moment I've got all the pieces scattered in a heap on the bench in front of me, which you can't see. This screw here, that clamps the flash contact here firmly. In this case it wasn't clamping anything because it wasn't done up tight. It doesn't need to be done up very tight, but it should at least have been making contact with the pieces below it. So here's our outer shutter case. Here we've got the curved rack that's driven from the cocking action of the camera, and here's the pusher that the curved rack moves, which in turn moves this piece, which cocks the main drive cam with its pin from its pinion there. What do we got here? So the back of the shutter, this lever here controls the aperture. Now that's very sticky in its action. That's full of oil. That's greasy. All of that needs to come apart. I can see oil on the diaphragm blades. That could be part of the resistance I'm feeling there. Alternatively, the lever may have grease and oil underneath it, causing it to drag on the case. And very likely, of course, it's a combination of both. So I remove those screws, remove the lever. This is soaking in oil. You can probably see that oil on the back of the case. That's supposed to be dry. That shim is glued down to the case with oil. And here's the setting lever for our flash sync speed and self timer. or delay action. Now we're down to the shutter case itself. 3 screws from the back, and they're tight, hold the mechanism plate and the shutter case together. Here I'm keeping a lot of downward pressure on that screwdriver while I turn it, so that the screwdriver doesn't cam out and damage the screws. So the shutter case can come off. Here's our shutter case with the diaphragm blades all assembled in there and looking a little bit oily. Here's our shutter blades assembly. Nothing particularly untoward to note there. There's a blob of something unfortunate looking on the end of that, the tail end of that shutter blade. Not sure what that looks, might be grease. Normally I start with the case. Took those components out. One of the screws went flying over there. I'll just drag that back into the picture. We have the setting ring, the diaphragm blades, 5 of them, quite oily looking as you can see. The retaining plate there, that they pivot in those positions there, and our 3 screws. So that's the diaphragm mechanism, and these are the first components that I clean up and put back together. This sort of forms the basis of the shutter, if you like. But before I do that, let's strip down the mechanism plate. I'll just push all that stuff to one side. Bring in the mechanism plate. Got 5 blades. Shutter blades are put in a certain order. I'm not sure it makes an awful lot of difference. First blade here, second, third, fourth and fifth. The blades are all identical. As I said, this one's got a blob of something unfortunate on it there. And the front face is pretty nasty looking. Hopefully they'll clean up with a bit of naphtha. If they don't, I'll have to polish them with a bit of brow soap and then clean them with naphtha. However, you find these things as you go. So first thing to do is try naphtha. Don't go looking for hard work. If they were showing, these 3 screws hold the lens tube onto the mechanism plate, and like the case screws at the back, that was very tight. It's certainly useful to have screws reasonably tight so that they don't rattle loose over time, but there's an obvious limit. The screws are very small, they strip out relatively easily, and it's a nuisance if they do. You're not getting a helicoil for threads that size, so you don't want to strip them out. So I'll take this apart. These are the 3 major components of the stripped mechanism plate. The plate itself, these levers stay on there, they're all riveted in place. This spring normally sits there because there's no reason to remove it. That's the detent for the blade actuating ring here. These are the pivots, if you like, that move the shutter blades. And this is the lens tube assembly which holds all this together, clamping them together. And the blade actuating ring runs round the centre of the lens tube. So there it is, that's the components of the shutter stripped down, and see if I can get you more of this in the picture. There you go, that's our shutter in pieces, and all of this needs to be cleaned now and reassembled. I'll start the clean up process here, I think, with the diaphragm blades. These are quite oily. I'm working on a dark grey paper towel here, so that you'll get some sense that the blade's not just jet black. Normally I would just work on a normal old white paper towel. And I'm looking at the way these blades are cleaning up, making sure that the oil is coming off them and the blades are clean, and I'm very pleased with the result there. What happens with diaphragm blades when they have oil on them is that the oil effectively glues the surfaces together, so the blades are reluctant to move. And that means that if you apply sufficient force on the setting ring to get the blades to move, you risk the likelihood of causing some damage. And the sort of damage that you get typically is that the blades end up distorted. They'll often end up with a bit of a curve to them, which makes it difficult to reassemble them in the shutter when you're putting it back together. These particular blades are less likely to suffer that because our pivot points are very close together. The diaphragm blades, more commonly seen in older cameras, often have the pivots at either end of the blade, and the blades in that case are very prone to being distorted and bowing up in the middle, one way or the other, making it very difficult to get them to lie flat enough so that you can reassemble them. The other problem that you often get when things are glued together is that the blades, the pivots, the little rivets that are on there on the blades, can actually tear out of the blade itself, rendering the blade effectively useless, because riveting them back pretty much requires that you would turn a suitable rivet on the lathe and then set it correctly. And unless you had a watchmaker's lathe and you had a good staking set, the chances of achieving that are probably not very high. It'd be much more sensible to find a parts camera to provide you with an undamaged blade. So some of the black marks you can see coming off on this cotton bud here that I'm using will not be oil and grease from the blade. It'll be pigment from the paper towel I'm working on. One other common problem with the diaphragm, if it is sticking together, is that the settings will shift. The diaphragm and the shutter speed are connected together with a spring that provides sufficient tension so that they stay where they're put. If the blades are stuck together, you may shift your shutter speed ring in the expectation that the diaphragm ring will follow it, and it may not, in which case you'll end up with incorrect exposures. Just looking at this, this is the moving plate that is rotated to swing the diaphragm blades inwards or outwards to change the size of the aperture. There's some slight staining on here at this point, and it's fingerprints. It's where someone's picked it up, and instead of handling it by the edges or even wearing gloves or using tweezers, they've just clamped it between finger and thumb, and you end up with marks like that, where they're basically skin oils and perspiration do things like that. Here's the fixed plate. Here I'm just using naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, to clean these components. And the fixed plate, one side of the plate, this side in fact, goes towards our diaphragm blades. The other side faces the shutter blades. And that is oil and filth coming off here. And that's just coming off the surface. That's the surface the shutter blades run against. It tells me that those blades were quite oily, and as a result the shutter speeds were, well, the shutter itself was likely to be, it may well have stuck, particularly in cold weather. You may have found that the shutter would stick and fail to open. And the slow speeds, the very slowest speeds, may well have been out, since with the extra drag of the oily blades against those surfaces, the main drive spring may have lacked enough power to park the blades back to the parked position. As the blades return to the parked position, that's when the spring is under least tension, and so a tired spring combined with sticky blades is a recipe for a shutter that either fails to close correctly at the end of the exposure on slow speeds, or is very sluggish to do it. Here I'm cleaning the shutter case. This is often the dirtiest part, of course, because it's on the outside. The oils usually percolate up from the focus helical at the back of this case. So this is often the oiliest part you're dealing with. Unless you strike something really strange, like shutters where some bright spark has opened the front, squirted some oil in order to fix their shutter problem, and ruined it. That's cleaning up quite well. See if I can get into the edges a bit better. The shutter blades swing out into those little recesses as they swing open, so they will want to be clean. And here I'm just cleaning the retaining ring threads at the back there. That should be fine. So the case is clean now, and I can reassemble the diaphragm. So I'll do that next.